Hi everyone, my name is Elaine or Lanying Xiao. I'm a research affiliate with the University of Rwanda's Center of Excellence in Biodiversity and Natural Resource Management, and I'm also a Global Challenges Fellow at the Sheffield Institute for International Development at the University of Sheffield in the United Kingdom. I want to wish everyone Happy Earth Day wherever you are, and I assume that if you're tuning into this video, that you are probably one of the people who are doing relatively well and keeping safe and secure during this time of pandemic. Um, so, so today actually I was asked to present a little bit on wildlife security and climate change. And I think it's a really good time to be thinking about security and wildlife and all of the kind of climate change and environmental change which is unraveling around us in these times on this day. It's actually kind of unusual that we think about wildlife security. We typically are focused around either human security, national or international security, and then some of us on environmental security. And rarely do we actually think about security in terms of wildlife. So I want to break down the term a little bit and then frame it in relation to climate change. At the end, I hope to leave us with some questions or issues to consider, especially as we're spending this Earth Day, many of us sheltering in place and having some time to imagine and hopefully co-create new realities that address the challenges that we're facing in better, more just, and hopefully species-inclusive ways. So security, usually we think about this in terms of safety and well-being, freedom from violence or harm, things like hunger or death. In the most extreme cases of insecurity, where we think about the context of war or armed violent conflict, which can cause displacement, famine, death, all kinds of horrific things. Security has a lot to do with our capabilities in these kinds of contexts or in the context of disruption. So in terms of resilience, our capacity to adapt. Wildlife security, we can think about it also in terms of its relationship to environmental security, which we typically thought about in mainly two ways. One was looking at environmental conditions, which could lead to insecurity of people or between peoples. Human security threatened by environmental insecurity, for example, when we look at water degradation or water insecurity and looking at how that can affect human well-being or survival. We can also think about conflict resources, high-value natural resources, which can lead to or somehow aggravate conflicts between people. And then we also think about environmental security in terms of impacts on the environment deriving from conflicts between humans. So this can include the impacts of the security sector as a threat to the environment or environmental degradation resulting from human conflicts. So wildlife security, if we take that sort of environmental security approach and apply it to non-human species that we consider wild, we could think about it in a similar sort of two-directional way. There are the wildlife conditions which can impact on international, national, or human security, and the impacts of security or insecurity on wildlife, the security sector, I mean. We can take coronavirus, COVID-19, as an example. Zoonotic disease is one way that wildlife can impact on security at the human, national, or international level. We're seeing it now, all of us locked up in our homes, borders closing all around the world. A lot of xenophobia, particularly directed at the country that is alleged to be the origin of the virus, which is leading to violence on the streets between certain people of color and those not. But let's also not forget that human diseases can be transmitted to wildlife and impact on their security. We see this in Rwanda when we look at the impacts of human influenzas on mountain gorillas. COVID-19 has also had some interesting collateral effects on wildlife. In many places, we're seeing wildlife thriving now under the dramatic reduction of human activity and presence, and I think many of us are celebrating this period of respite for wildlife. But in some places, we are seeing wildlife coming under increased threat due to lowered protections. For example, illegal hunting of high value species in protected areas. Now that protected area staff are not able to patrol or be as present as they may have been pre-coronavirus, pre-pandemic. Also, when people experience insecurity, this has effects on the security or well-being of other species. Think of all the non-human life which can be lost during a war. Trees cut or burned, ecosystems and all their inhabitants bombed or nuked, wildlife killed and or trafficked in war economies, not to mention all of the non-wartime impacts from things like military testing and training practices, environmental contamination or pollution from defense industries, and all of the human and non-human resources diverted to conflict-oriented activities rather than invested in the well-being of other species or of all life on Earth. So is wildlife security about the state of wildlife for the security of humans, or is wildlife security about a secure state of being for wildlife? I think this is actually an important question to ask because it changes or structures the way that we approach interventions for wildlife security. If we think about wildlife security as the safety and well-being of wildlife, or its freedom from direct physical violences like hunting, enslavement, imprisonment like zoos, or slaughter, even extinction, or indirect structural and cultural violences like habitat conversion and displacement, or the pervasive ideology that humans are somehow superior to all other life on Earth and even more sentient. Wildlife security could also then refer to the capabilities of species to thrive and adapt, or their freedom to, for example, live wild, natural ways in their natural habitats, that kind of thing. It would be a slightly different way of looking at wildlife security than thinking about what is the kind of well-being or security of wildlife that is necessary in order for humans to be secure. So I think that's one of possibly the nuances between wildlife security and environmental security, which is typically framed much more around a human or anthropocentric conceptualization of security. So one of the most obvious differences, of course, is that wildlife refers only to certain species within the entire spectrum of the environment or life on Earth, and even the concept of wild tends to be a very Western concept applied to non-human species, and especially non-human species that we don't consider to be domesticated or somehow a little bit too much tainted by humanity. Environment, on the other hand, is much more all-encompassing, especially when we think about ecological systems and their non-living elements and processes like water, minerals, and the atmosphere. In some cosmologies or worldviews, however, none of this is really divisible, and there's no such thing as wild versus not wild or human versus non-human. It's all life and interconnected. So in a way, actually, when we link wildlife security to climate change, we kind of bridge this divide between the species and the living systems. But generally, actually, wildlife security has been more heavily focused on species, and in practice, typically specific species. So we tend to have a heavy bias towards charismatic megafauna. Like in Rwanda, we focus a lot on mountain gorillas, rhinos, lions, elephants, making us very susceptible to plant blindness and other blinders, forgetting many much more life-essential species along the way. We may focus triage conservation efforts acutely on a few species rather than on the entire ecosystem. I believe this is a little bit of what happened in Rwanda during the genocide. There was what little of the conservation resources that managed to continue on during the genocide and the war or the conflict was maybe focused around, for example, mountain gorilla conservation, while the park itself, the habitat of the mountain gorilla and all of the species which basically constitute that ecosystem, were in many places overwhelmed by refugees and military maneuvers, etc. So what can we say about wildlife security in the context of climate change? What we know right now about the state of wildlife and the future of biodiversity on Earth is that it is threatened, and climate change amplifies that insecurity. We know that climate change is caused by and will cause further environmental change, habitat conversion, possibly desertification in some places, erosion or flooding in others, and species displacement. And when it comes to displacement, when I say species, I mean both human and other non-human, including wildlife, will be affected. In some cases, the displacement could be forced. Natural environments change so much that they're no longer inhabitable, and both humans and other species will shift to hopefully more amiable locations. In some cases, displacement will not be possible. Migration may be prevented by physical barriers, including border walls, political or social barriers like visa or entry restrictions. I mean, we're seeing this now with coronavirus, or economic inhibitions. You know, if I, for example, do not have the means to physically move, you know, I could remain stuck in place. Different people and different species of wildlife will be differently impacted in different places. We really don't understand right now how this will all play out yet, or the scale of all of the impacts of it. In some cases, migration may even be assisted. We're seeing this already with small island developing states negotiating climate change settlements in host countries. Some companies in the forestry sector have been looking at where certain species of trees will now need to be planted, or considering alternative species to prevent losses due to increasing infestation or vulnerability to certain kinds of illnesses. In some places, human and wildlife migrations will intersect, and these will create new relationships in human-wildlife dynamics. People will move into new ecosystems and cohabitate with species they're not familiar with. We are anticipating literally hundreds of millions to over 1 billion people being displaced or moving in the next decades. If we think COVID-19 has been disruptive to social, political, economic systems, climate change is going to be much worse. Although not all of the effects will be so sudden or easily attributable to a single culprit like a virus. There's also a lot of speculation about climate change aggravated conflict between humans, and again, as we've talked about already, conflict between people impacts easily on other species. In the future, you know, if the future of humanity is increasingly insecure, how do we safeguard the security of wildlife in this context? Will we continue to preference human security over the security of other species, or even a human understanding of wildlife security, which could ultimately undermine our own security? Or can we find a better, more integrated way of approaching security for all life on Earth? To get there, I think we will really need to overcome this separation between wildlife and human life and reorient ourselves around all life and life-sustaining processes or elements, taking a whole Earth approach. I really believe that's the only way we can truly talk about wildlife security in the context of climate change. I welcome any feedback, questions, or whatever on what I've just presented, and hope this will inspire some really good conversations and debates. I welcome all of you to contact me at e.shao@sheffield. Let's see if you can see this here. e.shao@sheffield.ac.uk. You can also find me at the number 1 Earth, number 4 Peace. That may have shown up backwards, I'm really not sure. And I hope that we can all find ways to connect despite all of the social distancing and the politicization of the separations that are in place right now. And I just want to leave all of us with one of the 4 Buddhist immeasurables. May all beings be free from suffering and the cause of suffering, and wish all of us a happy Earth Day. Thanks for listening.
Everyone, I am Professor Elias Bizuru from University of Rwanda, College of Science and Technology. Today we are celebrating the Earth Day with the thematic of climate action. This is why I'm going to talk about climate change and biodiversity. I'm going to focus specifically on species and ecosystems. Species are mostly threatened by climate change, and they do not have many options. The first option for species to survive will be to acclimate to changes through phenotypic plasticity. Species also can adapt to climate change through genetic changes. When they are not able to do the two, the species can shift their distribution. They can migrate to remain at equilibrium with climate change. It may happen also that species do not succeed the three options, and failing to acclimate, to adapt, or shift in distribution, species will go extinct. This is really a very big challenge species are experiencing now and will experience in the near future if nothing is done to conserve the species. The most problem we have actually is incompatible land use that remains the largest threat to biodiversity. This is in agricultural areas or urban areas. Incompatible land use will therefore increase as far as cultural systems will adapt to climate change. Some areas will become unfarmable and some new areas will be opened for agriculture. Likely, there will be population movements from coast areas and lowlands towards suitable areas for agriculture. For the case of Rwanda, people also will migrate from lowlands to uplands that will remain farmable. Actually, we experience huge concentration of people in the northern part of Rwanda because the land is more fertile and climate is also favorable in that area. When we look at the impact of climate change on nutrition, some areas in the world will likely be hotspots of food insecurity. Some other regions will face serious undernutrition. The case of our country is probably ranked among those who will experience food insecurity because of climate change. And because of this, people will have to migrate from locations with experiencing drought to locations with more fertility and more moisture. It is also expected that people will be pushed to overexploit some ecosystems like swamps and marshes. When we know that these ecosystems are storing huge amount of carbon by cultivating the swamps, not only biodiversity will be affected, but also the carbon, the huge amount of carbon stored into those ecosystems will be released in the atmosphere and therefore contributing to greenhouse gases emissions and worsen the situation. We know that swamps and marshes contain more carbon, even more carbon than forests, tropical forests. That's why these are not only fragile ecosystems, but they are very important for conservation. Because of climate change, it is expected that people will be concentrated on small lands with dramatic impact on biodiversity. The concentration of high density populations will affect negatively not only biodiversity inside protected areas, but also biodiversity outside protected areas. This is also currently being experienced in parts of some Sahelian countries where farmers have to internally migrate from the dry areas towards wetter areas. And looking at this phenomenon in Africa, the migration of people to more productive land, there is a fear that the greater congregation of people in smaller fertile areas will increase competition for valuable land and accelerate environmental degradation. Not only the environment will be degraded, but also we expect that some conflicts will arise because of competition to resources. It has already been suggested by some authors that climate change is associated with conflicts over land resources in Africa. Based on UNDP report of 2007, it is stated that the conflict in Darfur, for instance, was in part caused by tension between farmers and herdsmen over dwindling pasture and declining water holes. The report therefore warns that there could be a succession of new conflicts across Africa if not much is done to contain the damage of climate change. This means everyone is invited to contribute, to mitigate or adapt to climate change, to act now. Otherwise, not only biodiversity will be affected, but also security is at stake. Thank you very much.
My name is Arizima Nishimye, Assistant Lecturer at the University of Rwanda, College of Science and Technology, and a Research Associate to the Center of Excellence in Biodiversity and Natural Resources Management, a center that works under the University of Rwanda. As we are celebrating the World Earth Day during this COVID-19 lockdown, I would like to give a message about the role of women in climate change mitigation. We mean climate change mitigation activities that seek to cut or prevent the emissions of greenhouse gases, or activities that attempt to remove the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. In developing countries, women contribute to climate change mitigation in various ways, as they are responsible of different activities in their households, such as greening and cleaning their homes, cooking and farming. These women contribute to climate change mitigations if they choose to plant trees around their homes, or if they choose more clean energies and more clean cooking stoves. They also contribute to climate change mitigation. For instance, if they choose to manage their solid waste in a way that reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases. Uh, these are, for instance, reducing the production of solid waste, or reusing the produced waste, or recycling them. For example, they may produce the compost that may be used in agriculture, or they may produce the biogas from livestock manure that is used also in cooking. These women also contribute to climate change mitigation in agriculture sector, as they work there also as workforce, and they contribute to climate change mitigation if they choose more eco-friendly agriculture practices, such as no tillage, such as mixing crops with trees, also known as agroforestry, such as rotating crops, and also use leguminous crops that are nitrogen fixing, or if they choose also to use more organic fertilizers such as the compost, as mentioned earlier. Therefore, I would like to end my message by encouraging activists in climate change mitigation to involve women in their activities. I thank you very much, and I wish you a good day of World Earth Day celebration. Thank you.
Good morning. Today, as we are on 22nd April, we are celebrating the 15th anniversary of the Earth Day. As we can't gather together due to the COVID-19, everybody is celebrating this day being at home. It is not easy, but we can share different ideas that can help all of us to promote the environmental conservation. The theme of this year is climate action. We are all aware of the effects of climate change. Since past years, climate has been changing, and the effects are occurring in different countries worldwide. Land use has been changing, as well as the land cover, and this has been leading to the clearance of the natural forest. The habitat of wild animals and other wild biodiversity has been cleared and has been fragmented. Most of species lost the habitat and have been disappeared from the world. The forest has been changing too much, so the effects for carbon harvesting has been reduced, and this has been leading to the earth heat changing. Different actions have been taken, including restoration activities, either using exotic tree species or regenerating native tree species. However, the activities related to the land use change and land cover change are always occurring in different countries, and we are requested to take different actions aiming for the environmental conservation. It is not an easy task, and it is not an exercise to be done individually. Everybody is invited to take action, to advocate for the environmental conservation and for the restoration activities. If we can do so, different disasters related to the climate change may continue to occur, and different pandemic may occur due to the adaptation of different various exotic species. It is time now to stand up, to work together, to advocate and to work together for the environmental conservation. It is not a lesson for all of us, as the effects related to the climate change are occurring everywhere. It has been devastating most of the agricultural activities, and this has been leading to the hunger and food loss in different countries. Most of wild species cannot survive as long as there is climate change, and this is leading to different other activities related to ecosystem functions, such as pollination, seed dispersals, and photosynthesis, which is playing a great role for harvesting carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. What we have to do in this time is individual, but we have to take different actions related to the nature conservation. If we are planning for restoration, for example, let us focus on the regeneration of native tree species that are indigenous to the area. If we are practicing the agricultural activities, let us try eco-agriculture and use the farming which is environmental friendly. We can reduce the use of pesticides. We can use the natural biodiversity able to participate and reduce the number of exotic species that are pested to the plants. We can also reduce the use of chemical fertilizers that are harmful for the most of soil fauna, which is very important for soil ecosystem functioning. As we know, most of them are the decomposers, the organic nutrient recycling, and once they are no longer present in the soil, some of the ecological function may not occur, and this may affect the soil ecological functions. Let us work together to promote the environmental conservation. Thank you. Stay at home and stay safe.
Hello everyone, today is the Earth Earth Day under the theme Climate Action. Climate change is a global challenge affecting countries in both global north and global south. So, we all need to pay for climate change mitigation. My name is Dr. Kalisa Jid, Air Quality Specialist. As a London scientist, how am I dealing with climate change mitigation? Well, my research is in exposure assessment, understanding how much pollution people breathe and how to reduce those exposure. I have the ability to lead the nascent field of air quality research in sub-Saharan Africa, which has the potential to transform the lives of many millions of people. Air pollution and climate change are closely related. These are the two of the planet's main environmental problems. Burning of fossil fuel, for example, is a major source of air pollution and greenhouse gases. Many air pollutants contribute to climate change. For example, some pollutants, such as black carbon and ozone, increase the warming by trapping heat in the atmosphere. Clean air is one of the basic needs for human life and well-being. The World Health Organization Air Quality Assessment confirmed that 92% of the world population lives in a place where air pollution levels exceed the WHO limit, and about 7 million people die every year from air pollution. Monitoring air quality is the first step to identify the major sources of these air pollutants and be able to set up mitigation measures. Thanks to the government of Rwanda and the Rwanda Environment Management Authority for establishing several ambient monitoring networks across Rwanda. I previously showed how, for example, Car-Free Day, as well as other non-working days in Kigali City, significantly reduce air pollution. My recent article revealed that air pollution has also decreased to 20% during this pandemic lockdown, COVID-19, just within a week. All these findings provide a clear picture how climate change or air pollution is linked to human activities. So, what can be done? Rwanda has implemented several policies locally to control air pollution. Extensive monitoring is required to quantify the effect of these policies on air quality. Here are a few tips you can do to reduce air pollution. Conserve energy at home, at work, or everywhere. For example, turn off the light when not in use. Use public transportation. Walk whenever possible. Share a ride to work. Avoid excessive idling of your car. An idling engine can produce up to twice as many exhaust emissions as an engine in motion. On this occasion of the Earth Day, we must pledge to take care of our planet by planting trees and by controlling pollution. So let us work together. Let us be part of the solution, not part of the air pollution problem. Thank you.
Climate change is not only something of the future, but the climate has already changed significantly over the last few decades. The average temperature around the globe has increased by 0.75 Celsius degree over the last 100 years. The rich variety of life on the Earth has always had to deal with a changing climate through adaptation. Some may cope and adapt under changing climates, but not all can adapt. Hence, changing climate is a big threat to biological diversity. It is now recognized that climate change and biodiversity are interconnected. The question is, what about human beings? Biodiversity is affected by climate change, with negative consequences for human well-being, such as through the scarcity of goods and services that are provided by biodiversity. And these services include provisioning, regulating, supporting, as well as cultural services that are needed by human to maintain his quality of life. Since human depends on these services to maintain the quality of life, the changes in temperature patterns and rainfall patterns affect either directly or indirectly human beings, most especially in developing countries. Why developing countries? Because these countries are recognized to be poor, having poor technology or inadequate capacities to contain or mitigate the different impacts that may result from changes in climatic factors. These developing countries are affected in diverse ways, such as through droughts, floods, and less expected water availability. Most natural ecological systems are also affected, since human encroachment in the search for subsistence also is amplified. For example, biodiversity in the highlands of East Africa is severely threatened, where 25 to 40% of large mammal species in national parks will be endangered. Wildlife tourism will also be at risk in East and Southern Africa, for example, due to lower density of large mammals, for example. In some developing countries, tourism contributes to the gross domestic product, the GDP, that is a major source for financial means to improve national development. Biodiversity is subjected to many changes, and these are due to human activities that alter the normal functioning of the Earth and the climate system. An alteration in the normal biological and physiochemical processes obviously affect a wide range of biodiversity, where species may undergo extinction. For example, even other species may undergo a tremendous decline in their population due to lack of adaptation faced to climatic changes. An example is the recent extinction of the golden toad and the Montverde harlequin frog, already reported as the first victims of climatic change. Changes in the climate has major implications not just for the variety of life on our planet, but also for the livelihoods of people around the world. This is seen in the agriculture sector, where food production and security may be stressed. Climate change is already a reality. Even if all anthropogenic emissions were to stop now, changes would continue into the future. We must therefore increase climate change mitigation and adaptation efforts to mitigate impact of climate change on biodiversity and human livelihood at large. Thank you very much.
Happy Earth Day 2020 from Rwanda. I'm Dr. Lane Munir, and I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Excellence in Biodiversity and Natural Resource Management at the University of Rwanda. My research focus is on the relationship between gender and environmental conflict, and that necessarily entails gender and environmental change. So I've been asked to say a few words. Because Earth Day 2020 has its thematic focus, climate change. So I wanted to share some information about what we know and where we're headed when we discuss the status of women and climate change around the world. So it is particularly important that we think about this in the context of developing countries, which is what I do in Rwanda. And this is particularly important in Africa, because 70% of Africans rely on agriculture for their livelihoods. So much of the discussion is about climate change and its impact on food production. And if you want to understand why climate change impacts men and women differently, you just need to think about the different ways that men and women use land. So women do the majority of subsistence farming production across Africa. And when women use land, studies show they use land closer to home for daily domestic use. When men use land, studies show they travel farther away from home and they're more likely to engage in hunting or collecting timber or using the environment to engage in a cash economy. So those are very different activities, and they have very different needs and very different outcomes. So because of women's particular use of land, they have certain vulnerabilities based on their gender. And one of the pressing issues in Africa is that when there are environmental changes due to climate, agricultural women and women in rural areas are particularly vulnerable because they are statistically less likely to have savings and liquid assets that will support them in an instance of environmental change or financial shock. They are less likely to be titled landowners, and then when they do have their name on land, research indicates that they're less likely to engage in meaningful decision making about how that land is used. And overall, women tend to have less financial resources than their male counterparts, which would help them avoid economic vulnerability due to climate change reasons. Across Africa, women tend to have a lower level of education, and that makes it more difficult for them to navigate new laws and policies about the environment. It makes it more difficult for them to navigate the government, bureaucracies, nonprofit humanitarian assistance, because they don't have documentation and literacy levels to help them get the information that they need. And several studies have shown that, particularly in rural areas, men and women's realm of decision making is differentiated, and women have a louder voice when it comes to domestic issues in the home, but when it comes to public matters, such as how communal land is used, women are less likely to make decisions that have a meaningful outcome. And then I think a best way to think of it is that, I just read a UNDP policy report about the gender dynamics of natural disasters. And what the UNDP, it was a policy brief, pointed out was that also in terms of socialization of men and women, young girls and young women are less likely to be taught the skills that are necessary to survive a natural disaster that's caused by climate change. So for example, we know that climate change causes desertification. the creation of deserts, which then makes land more vulnerable to flooding when it does actually rain. And girls are shown in surveys to be less likely to know how to swim and to be less likely to know how to climb trees and have other skills that would help them, for example, in a flood. So it's not just the gender differentiated way that men and women use land, but also the skills they've been taught to survive the natural disasters that are a consequence of global climate change. But the good news is we have some really great evidence about the best ways to move forward to improve the accounting of women's voices and women's experience when we create environmental policy. And the single best thing we can do, much of this research comes out of the US and Europe, but it applies around the world, is that studies indicate that women voters tend to vote in environmentally friendly ways. They tend to be more supportive of environmental protection laws and policies, as well as the public representatives who support an environmental platform. So a great way to help the environment is to be a female voter who engages and to also encourage every woman you know to also cast her vote. And relatedly, because of this, there's some evidence that indicates that female leaders might have more environmentally friendly platforms when they run for public office, and that female politicians, once in office, have more environmentally friendly laws and policies that are part of their agenda. So getting women involved and getting women involved at key roles in leadership, whether it's in a government, a regional organization, a nonprofit, a university, getting women leaders in positions of power where they can have an impact on the environment is a great start. And this is part of I guess I would say an effort that's been made in the last few years is to better account for women's, especially rural women's, unique knowledge and skill set when it comes to the environment. So any environmental policy or change or research that isn't gender mainstreamed isn't efficient. So there's no better expert on water quality in a given rural community than the very women who are responsible for carrying that water home for domestic use. There's no better expert on seed dispersal and foliage than the very women who are collecting those leaves for medicinal and food use in the household. So we are increasingly understanding that it is absolutely vital to not just gather information on a given environment, but to specifically ask women what they know and what they think, because their knowledge base is very unique and is vital to understanding processes. And this is part of I think, a total approach that everyone, whether you're in environmental policy or not, or you're just a voter, or you're just an engaged citizen, that we think about ways to be gender sensitive in our thinking, our decisions, and our actions at every level. And for those of you who are watching in your home and wondering what you can do today, a very concrete action you can take has to do with how you spend your money. So the next time that you make a donation to a nonprofit organization, I want you to think about how this organization accounts for the needs of women in its work. So if you're giving to an environmental organization, do they have particular information related to how they account for the experiences of women in the communities that they help? Do they have hiring practices that are helpful to having female employees in positions of power? And if you're going to buy anything, whether it's tea or coffee or fresh produce or personal hygiene products, any product that you buy that's derived for the environment, I want you to think about whether that company or that corporation engages in gender sensitive strategizing in how they collect their materials, in who they hire, in who sells their product, and in general, do women benefit from this company's environmental practices? That's something that we can all do at home, and everyone as a consumer and as a donor is in an incredible position of power to use their finances in a way that improves women's relationship with the environment and our understanding of women's contributions to environmental protection and helping mitigate the effects of climate change. So thank you so much for being an engaged citizen and caring about Earth Day 2020. And let's see what we can do to help end climate change in the next years. Thank you so much.